The COVID-19 pandemic has resulted in many changes in the way the world operates. The education system has not been exempt. Last year, schools closed in early March and students didn't return to in-person instruction until the start of this school year. Even then, all students didn't return at the same time, and even as we close this year, some have still not returned at all. Virtual instruction has been provided at some level, but this study aims to compare reading achievement during this school year with the previous school years. My research question is, has the COVID-19 pandemic affected students' learning, particularly in the area of reading? My objectives in conducting this research were to review and compare progress in reading achievement this school year versus previous school years, to discuss factors of reading instruction that affect student outcomes, and to discuss ways that virtual instruction due to the pandemic has affected student outcomes. Prior to conducting the research, I hypothesized that progress in reading achievement has declined this year in comparison to previous school years. We expect to see more students having difficulty learning to read as well as progressing through that process. This study was conducted as an archival research study. It includes basic research aiming to develop knowledge, theories, and predictions, as well as expand understanding and eventually lead to solutions to the problems at hand. It is exploratory research aiming to explore the main aspects of the problem. Initial research was conducted on a newly identified issue. This research was done in the field in a natural classroom setting. Secondary data was previously collected by classroom teachers. I was able to pull that data from a database within the district, and a statistical analysis was completed to understand frequencies, averages, and correlations. The only materials necessary to complete this research was the data from the enriched database. Classroom teachers administer reading assessments to students at the beginning, in the middle, and at the end of each school year to determine students' instructional level in reading. I was able to pull batch reports from the entire first grade classes of 3 school years, the current school year and the 2 previous school years at a single elementary school here in the district. Again, students' instructional levels of reading in the fall were compared to the instructional reading levels in the winter. There is a graphic on the school's website aimed particularly at parents to explain the expected growth for reading levels of students. So this study aimed to compare what we were seeing happening versus what we were expecting. To revisit the research question, has the COVID-19 pandemic affected students' learning, particularly in the area of reading? The research was conducted based on the chart pictured, which shows the Sumter School District instructional level expectations for reading. Students in the first grade are considered to have met those expectations by beginning the school year at a level D or E. Um, and in January, the second interval, according to this chart, corresponds to the assessment that students take in winter. The next step guided reading assessment, those scores from students who are at a level G are considered to be appropriate for progressing, and a level H are appropriate for students who have met those expectations for reading. This chart displays the results of student reading assessment at the beginning of each school year. In the 2018-2019 school year, 40 students were at the expected reading level out of a total of 124. That corresponds to about 32% of students. In 2019, about 27% of students began the school year at the expected reading level. And this current school year, 2020-2021, only about 21% of students began the school year at the expected reading level. In the past 2 school years, we can see that it wasn't much of a difference in the percentages of about how many students began the school year at the expected reading level. But in this current school year, These are the students whose kindergarten year was interrupted because of the COVID-19 pandemic. We left schools in March, and those students did not return to their kindergarten classrooms, so they didn't quite have the chance to make um, the transition like a traditional first grader would have. They left kindergarten early and came right back to first grade. And even at that time, not all of our students returned at the beginning of the school year, and were able to have that face to face instruction as far as making gains throughout the school year, which we will see next. So here we have the middle of year reading assessment results. Again, in 2018, about 47% of students um, were meeting expected reading levels by the middle of the school year when compared to the 32% who were meeting those expectations at the beginning of the school year. In 2019, about 43% of the students were meeting expectations in the middle of the school year compared to 27% at the beginning of the school year. So we've been able to see some major growth in both school years. However, in the current school year, again, these are the students whose kindergarten year was interrupted, so they returned to school as a first grader. So that's a major transition, and then being able to take this new reading instruction that they've received and make progress in their reading. Only 31% of students met expected reading levels as measured in the middle of the year this current school year. There are many different aspects of direct reading instruction that affect student outcomes. Two particular areas that I'd like to discuss at this time are absenteeism and lack of explicit instruction. In the virtual world, we have seen an increase in absenteeism among students, not only hybrid students returning to school, but virtually students not logging in, students logging in and then leaving, and even so much as students logging in but not particularly paying attention to the lesson or not being engaged well enough to understand what's being taught. That ties right on in with lack of explicit instruction, not being able to engage in the lesson or not participating, not coming to class, not logging on for class. All of those things contribute to absenteeism and lack of explicit instruction, which we can see does have an impact on students' reading achievement. Implications for the field include changes in teaching strategies for virtual classrooms. Engaging students in the lessons has been a huge task for teachers this year, particularly students who have been in that traditional classroom setting and have now had to transition to being virtual students. That has been a major change for them and has affected the way that they're able to engage with the lessons that they're being taught. There also needs to be an emphasis on face-to-face aspects as we return in the fall. School districts will need to get professional development opportunities in place for teachers who will have those students returning, especially those students who did not return this entire school year. It's going to be another big transition for them, just going from traditional classroom to virtual and back to traditional. There's a lot of differences between being a virtual student, having access to everything in your home at your fingertips while you're learning versus being a traditional student in the classroom. There's policies and procedures that have to be followed. There's a way to do things, and the students will need help making that transition. Limitations for this research included demographics, as well as the exclusion of virtual students. Demographics were unable to be collected during this research process, and virtual students were not assessed using the next step guided reading assessment, so we do not have data on their current reading progress outside of the qualitative data that their teachers collect. Um, in the future, being able to collect those demographics to determine different aspects of the virtual instruction, of the direct reading instruction, will help to kind of determine what areas need to be focused on with virtual students, and with students who have been virtual, hybrid, traditional, that mix up the way that some students came and left and came or didn't come, never came, stayed the entire time as long as the school was available to them. But even with that, all the students left in March. So at some point, every student has been a virtual student. And if not, that is an even more major area for us to focus on, because if you weren't virtual, you weren't getting any instruction at all. So just being able to collect those demographics and determine where students were and how they got access to their instruction would greatly help going forward. And again, the virtual students did not complete the next step guided reading assessment, and there is no data collected on their current reading achievement. Future research should include longitudinal studies to determine the long-term effects of the COVID-19 pandemic on students' academic achievement. Um, just revisiting some of the points I made about those kindergarten students who went home in March of last year and returned to a traditional classroom at some point this school year, or did not return and will return next year as second graders. That's a very large gap of time that they were not traditional students. And while some students do have those families that make it a priority to assist them with, accessing their instructional materials and their educational materials, all students do not have that support at home. And so I do think it is going to be important to determine the long-term effects on student academic achievement due to the COVID-19 pandemic.